Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Shades of Entrepreneurship. This is your host, Mr. Gabriel Flores. Today, I'm here with J.D. Barker. J.D., how are we doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I'm excited about this one because JD is an author and he actually does a lot of cool books. One of them actually being Forsaken. And some of them are kind of ventured into an area where I actually love to read, which is the sci-fi world. But before we get into all of that, JD, go ahead and introduce yourself. Who is JD?
Well, New York Times bestseller. I've got books all across the board at this point. I jump around between horror and thrillers. I've written a bunch of books with James Patterson. I think we've got five or so out there. A few movies and TV shows in the works. Having a ball, basically making a living, making shit up. Can't
I
beat
love
that.
it. Folks, James Patterson masterclass. He actually has a masterclass. So if you're actually interested in learning how to read or write a book, I would highly recommend checking that out. So JG, let's talk about how did you get into becoming an author? Was this kind of like your first iteration into entrepreneurship? Is just writing books, or what did you do before?
No, so I've got a crazy journey to actually get here.
That's what I
Writing is
like to
something I've
hear.
done my entire life. It's something I've always done for fun. I grew up without a TV in the house, so we were hitting the library at a really early age. I've got a sister that's about a year younger than me, so I used to write stories and I would staple them, and I had a little library in my room. She would check them out. I would charge her late fees. So it's something that's been going on pretty much my whole life. But my parents kind of drilled into my head, writing is a fun hobby, but you can't make a living doing that. You need to get a real job. So, I graduated high school, I went off to college, and I was down in Fort Lauderdale in Miami working on a business and finance degree. But I couldn't keep my hands out of the art side of it. I enjoyed it too much. So while I was in school, I got a job with BMG Records, which is a distribution company. And if you've ever seen the movie Get 'Em to the Greek, that was essentially my job. I'd have to pick up recording artists at the airport, get them to the radio station, get them to their concerts, get them, hotel, wherever, and then get them back on their airplane when it was time to leave town. And to really date myself, this was people like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson and New Kids on the Block and Madonna. Then we got all the hair bands, Guns N' Roses, Poison, Motley Crue. But I quickly realized, I've got some very famous people in the car with me, sometimes for a week at a time. I've got student loan debts that are racking up. How can I pay for these things? So I started to interview them, and I sold those interviews to magazines like People and Teen People and 17. And that's kind of how I broke into the industry. And when you work with anybody in a newspaper or magazine, you quickly find that they've got a novel in a desk drawer somewhere that they've been working on for 5, 10 years. It's 500,000 words long. They think it's almost done. And I kind of became the go-to guy for people to hand those off to. I would run through them and fix grammar and punctuation and help them with story development and help them get it to the point where it's a publishable novel. So I kept doing that, while I was getting my degree. So ultimately, I got my degree in business and finance. I ended up working for a brokerage firm in Palm Beach, Florida, and kind of went up through the ranks to the point where I was a chief compliance officer. I was there for 20 some years, and I hated it. I mean, it was a horrible job, but it paid really good. So we had the nice house, we had the cars, we had a boat, we had all the trappings of that, that nice big paycheck. But I hated the job, and I would come home at night and I would work on books in order to stay sane. And at the time, I was doing mainly ghostwriting and book doctor projects, tweaking books that other people had written and getting them out there for publication. And over those 2 decades, I had 6 different ones that hit the New York Times list, all with other people's names on the cover. And that gets really old after a while. So when that sixth one hit up, my wife pulled me aside and she came up with this crazy plan. She knew I wanted to be a writer. So we sold everything that we owned. We bought a duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side, lived in the other side, and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the bank statement. And I remember the day she showed it to me. She said, "It looks like we've got about 18 months worth of savings for you to write that book. Go." And it's been a wild roller coaster. The first one I ended up self-publishing, but it sold about 250,000 copies, which was enough to put me on the radar of the traditional guys. And with my second book, I scored a 7-figure deal with it was HMH at the time. Now it's HarperCollins, with a film and TV show attached. And it's kind of been that same roller coaster wild ride ever since.
That is remarkable. I think the one thing that's actually quite remarkable is having the foresight to when you're with the BG group and having the opportunity to have all these, stars in your car, and then just looking at that and saying, you know what, I think I have an opportunity to one, continue to tap into my passion, which was writing, but also create a source of revenue from it. How did that,
Yeah.
that idea, I think that in itself is the kind of essence of entrepreneurship right there.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know that being an entrepreneur can actually be taught. I feel like it's almost a gene or something you're bought with because you tend to spot it, in random places, and you find it. It's like being a rainmaker. You could be totally broke, and somebody could have put a pine cone in your hand. And if you're an entrepreneur, you'll figure out how to turn that pine cone into $1 million business inside of a year. So for me, it's kind of always been that way. I've been very good at that sort of thing. Even when the book started to sell, we had some nice paydays at the beginning, but I kept having flashbacks to the music business. I had so many people that I had worked with that had that one big hit, and they brought in, literally millions of dollars off of one song. And, they bought a Ferrari, they bought a house on Miami Beach. They had all these things. And then, 4 or 5 months later, I saw the Ferrari disappear, and then it became a Lexus, then it became a Toyota, and then the house was gone, and they were in an apartment, and then they vanished altogether. Like, people just, generally don't know how to manage money. I was working in finance, like when the books hit, so I looked at that very closely. So when the money started coming in, we actually took all of it and we put it into real estate, which we still do today. We ended up buying rental properties, and then we flipped it, I think 59 houses, when we were in the Pittsburgh area. And at this point we own a whole bunch of rental properties, more or less as a side hustle that's turned into a full-time business of its own. So my wife and I are always looking for opportunities.
What would you say, going through the different interviews with your opportunity to kind of interview some celebrities, what would you say was one of the most unique stories that you remember to this day?
There's a couple of them. So Madonna, very early on, she was on her Vogue tour when I worked with her, and we talked, and she told me that she did basically the same process for every album that came out. She would make a list of what other people were doing to promote their albums at the time, and then she would create a list of things that didn't appear on the first list, things completely outside of the box, and that's what she would have her marketing people focus on. And Madonna obviously did really well doing that. And if you remember, I'm old enough to remember, her hitting it. Every single album just kind of came out of, took over the world. And it was because of that. It was because of that particular mindset. So that has always stuck with me. I think that she called it zigging instead of zagging. So anytime I get any type of idea put in front of me, I weigh it against what everybody else is doing, and I try to find some way to tweak it and turn it into something original.
That is a brilliant idea. I really like that concept because at the end of the day, I think business in general, that's kind of the goal of entrepreneurship as well. Is if you can find a solution, okay, well, how can you make the solution better, right? How can you make it
Yeah,
more
yeah.
efficient?
Absolutely. I'll give you another example. I mean, working with James Patterson, I've picked his brain, clean at this point on the business side of things. A lot of people don't realize that he actually came from the business world. He was in advertising in New York, when he started writing. He wrote the Toys R Us theme song, which everybody back in the day knew. But when his first book hit, his very first one was called The Thomas Berriman Number. It didn't sell at all. I don't think he even has a copy of that one. His second book was called Along Came a Spider. And it did okay as a hardcover when it first came out, but it didn't light up the charts the way that he had hoped that it would. And any regular author, or most authors anyway, would kind of just accept that and shrug their shoulders and move on with their life. Jim wasn't willing to do that, so he put up $500 of his own money, and he filmed a television spot. And nobody used TV back in the day to promote books. And it was a very simple spot. It was basically, I think it said something like, "Your wait for the next Silence of the Lambs is over." And then a spider kind of crawled down from the corner of the screen. And that lit up that particular book, and it turned it into an international bestseller. And that's what sparked his career. So again, I think it's that entrepreneur gene. Some people have it and some people don't. And you find that little spark, regardless of what else is going on around you.
Yeah, no, that's again another great analogy in regards to like trying to find like think outside the box, folks. So I really, really enjoy that analogy because again, it's simple yet creative, right? And to your point, nobody was in that area yet.
No, and simple and creative, I think that's key because I found, like, in the book world, if you write a story, the smallest amount of words that can be used to describe it, like if you describe a story in 3 words, in 5 words, that book is going to be a hit. If it takes you a paragraph, it takes you 2 minutes or whatever to tell somebody what a book is about, that book is going to hit the shelves and it's going to vanish. You take something like the movie Alien: In Space, Nobody Can Hear You Scream. Like, that particular tagline tells you everything you need to know. And, like, just hearing that tagline from a marketing standpoint, that is going to be a hit. So we weigh that heavily now in today's world. When I've got a new book coming out, we weigh the title, we weigh the tagline, the cover on the front of the book. There's focus groups involved. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes before it ends up on the shelf at Walmart.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy you mentioned that, because one of the things I've been doing here in the basement was basically going through SEO for my website, and very similar, right? Where you essentially need to be able to describe your web page and what it's the value of it for the individual visiting the web page in less than 5 words, right?
Yeah.
And then they have the meta description. So you have, like 140 characters, 144 max. But even that might be too long, because folks, when you actually post this stuff online, then it actually cuts out some of your characters. And then you have to kind of be thoughtful about how many characters you use in that as well. And yeah, it gets quite convoluted, but it's really fun because it really tests your knowledge. And folks, I'll be completely transparent. I love the thesaurus. So if you ever read my blog post, you might find some unique words, because I will truly go and actually look on the thesaurus and see, this is what I mean. How can I get this one sentence into a single word, right? And that sometimes is very difficult. Now, JD, let's talk about your transition into the books. One of the things you mentioned is you and your wife, you sold everything, you moved into a small duplex, and then you had essentially 18 months, and then you self-published. Take us through the process of self-publishing a book for individuals that may not know that process.
Sure. So at the time, that wasn't what I had planned. I wrote the book, and it was a very solid story. I'd been down this road before. I knew what the people in New York were looking for in a basically a mass market bestseller. Where I made a mistake is I had no clue how to query agents. So I created more or less a form letter and sent it out to a list of agents that I purchased from somebody. I think there were 200 or so on there. It was literally to whom it may concern letter. And I just shot it out, and I didn't get a whole lot of replies, and I didn't understand why. Now the actual process, you really need to go to every agent's website. They all have their own little terms on there. They want to see the first chapter. They want to see the first 3 chapters. They want it in Times New Roman font. This one wants an Arial font. You need to jump through all those hoops, or it basically gets deleted the second it goes, pops up in their inbox. But at the time, I didn't know that. So I didn't get a whole lot of response. I figured, I'll go ahead and self-publish it, just to see what happens with it. What that basically means is I had to act as the publishing company. I had to find somebody to print the book. I had to find distribution for that book. I had to find a way to get it into stores. This was 2014, so it wasn't quite as difficult as it was, let's say, 5 years earlier than that. Amazon with Kindle and all that already existed. There were platforms out there to get it done. But I put the book out, and initially the sales were decent, but they didn't, it didn't get knocked out of the park or anything. It wasn't that wild. But in the story, I borrowed some characters from Stephen King, and there's a backstory to that. He basically gave me permission in order to use these. But after a failed trip to his house, I basically, when I went to get permission, I printed out the manuscript, hopped in the car, and basically went over to Stephen King's house. Hoping to find him outside and hand him the manuscript, which is not how life works. Ultimately, I ended up reaching out to a friend who knew King really well, and he gave me an email address, and I sent the book off to him that way. But regardless, he read the book, he liked it, and he gave me his permission to use these things. And after the book came out, I met with a publicist, and I told her about this failed trip that I had to King's house, and she said, "You know what? I think that's the story." So she pitched, I believe it was Publishers Weekly, and they wrote up an article about my failed attempt to get to Stephen King's house for this particular book. And when that story came out, librarians saw it, bookstores saw it, and that's what actually lit up that particular title and caused it to sell as well as it did. And once it caught on, it was like wildfire.
What's really interesting too is as you're kind of talking about your transition from your former role over in BG to becoming an author. But one of the things is your network continues to expand. And you mentioned, you were able to connect with somebody that knows Stephen King directly. So you're able to, how important has networking been to your career?
Oh, it's huge. When I go to a conference, if I'm in the elevator with somebody, I make sure I know who that person is, and I try to get contact information whenever possible. And sometimes contact may not be useful to you, until 3, 5 years down the road. But having those contacts is huge. I don't think in any business you can succeed without that.
Yeah, I could not believe, I could not agree more, folks. In fact, folks, if you go visit the Shades of Entrepreneurship, the shadesofE.com, you're going to see a list of the entrepreneurs that we've interviewed. But in addition to that, if you visit me on LinkedIn / Mr. Gabe Flores or Mr. Gabriel Flores, you're going to see the amount of events that I do kind of on a consistent basis. And JD, one of the things you mentioned was conferences. I think sometimes, I think some individuals feel they're above a conference, like there's nothing else they could learn from a conference. But I truly find a lot of value, not only in sometimes attending the sessions, but actually in the networking of the conference.
Yeah, that's where it really happens. I mean, I noticed, like when COVID hit, a lot of the conferences were either canceled or we were doing things on Zoom. And for me, a lot of business, it kind of dried up, just because that wasn't happening. I go to a conference at this point and I'm kind of in the same boat you just mentioned. There's not a panel that's going to, teach me something new at this point. But where it's beneficial to me is at the bar, in the hallways, in the elevators, at the cocktail receptions. Those interactions, that's where the deals that kind of move my needle forward, move my career, that's where they happen. So I make it a point to get into every one of those situations and stay there. Like I don't just appear at the cocktail reception. I'm there the whole time. If my wife goes with me, a lot of times we'll divide and conquer because, if we stay together, then we don't talk to anybody else. So we'll try and work our way through the room, because that's what it's there for. And you got to take advantage of that. Like I was at Thriller Fest in New York at one point, and Lee Child was in the elevator with me. Like I had 15 seconds to talk to the guy for the very first time. I talked to him about blurbing my book, giving me one of those quotes on the back. I could have just as easily, stood there and watched the numbers tick away and watched him leave the elevator. But I'm not that person. I figure if you don't ask the question, you're not going to get an answer.
You know what you kind of serendipitously highlighted, and the one of the things that's so important is the elevator pitch. And why? Let's talk about your elevator pitch and how you create it and the importance of it.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to a book, like before I even write a book, I create the title and the tagline, which is basically the one sentence describing it. And I create the back of book blurb, which is the 200 words you typically see like on the back of a paperback. That later becomes my pitch, so if I'm talking to film and television guys, I can rattle that off, for whatever book it might be. And you have to be ready for that because a lot of authors aren't. A lot of conferences have these things called pitch fest where it's almost like speed dating with agents. You get a minute or two in front of an agent and you've got to tell them about your book, and then the bell rings and you have to move on to somebody else. Authors need to practice that, that you're selling a product in the end, and you need to be able to articulate it, and you need to be able to get that point across, and you need to be remembered. When you walk away from that table, you want to be the person that they remember at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's completely true. And folks, our attention spans as humans is limited, right? And it continues to kind of get smaller and smaller, to slowly dwindling, right? Now, with that said, if you do attend a conference, a few recommendations I would highly, folks that are putting conferences together, if you have vendors there, I would highly encourage you guys to create either some type of like bingo or monopoly board. So you encourage your attendees to actually attend and visit each one of those vendors and have this card, like a monopoly card, where they can actually stick, a color coded or a sticker or whatever to indicate that, yes, this guest has in fact attended and visited our vendor. So that kind of creates that value back to the vendor. And then at the end, have everybody go ahead and put those things into a bucket, right? A drawing. Right. And so have their name and their email. And so now you have their name and the email inside this bucket, right? And you pull out and the winner gets like a free attendance to the conference next year. Now for the vendors, similar opportunity. When you have that opportunity and you're right there, and have your table have like a little giveaway. Right. If you're able to, I know some laws, like I'm in healthcare, the Stark law. So we have to abide by that. But if you have an opportunity to have a little bit of a giveaway, encourage individuals, say, hey, drop your business card into this bucket so you have a chance to win this thing. Because essentially what you're doing is you're now accumulating all that contact information from these individuals that come through. And then as JD mentioned, try to make yourself memorable when you're at the table visiting. If the vendor is someone or an agent or someone you really want to, build a relationship with, make sure you have that elevator pitch down, as JD mentioned. And it's really important that it is extremely brief, like truly 10 to 15 seconds. I think the average time from a video perspective is like 2 seconds. And then we lost our, lost our concentration so when you really have those opportunities, make sure, you really capitalize on them. Now, JD, what was your first, you mentioned you're down in the duplex with the wife, you're on your first book. What was that first book? And then how did that then lead? You mentioned you got that book and then you went to a 7-figure deal. So talk about that kind of transition.
Yeah, so the first one was called Forsaken. It was an outright horror novel. It was basically about a witch, and fairly scary. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Stephen King, so that was my goal. That's the market I was kind of shooting for at the time. But I knew I didn't want to write the same book over and over again, which is kind of a trap that happens. If you start selling really well, you have a book that hits the New York Times list, your agent and your publisher, they're going to come back to you and they're going to say, we want that same book but different, and they're going to want that same book but different for the next 20 years. Lee Child again is a good example of that. Lee Child is not his real name. His real name is James Grant, which is on his Wikipedia page. He wrote under multiple pen names in different different series and different books. And the Jack Reacher book just happened to take off. And before he knew it, it's 20 years later, and he's known by his pen name, and he's stuck writing that same book over and over again. I didn't want that to be me. So my first book was horror. My second one was a thriller. My third one was horror. Next one was a thriller. I went back and forth. If you go to my Wikipedia page, it basically says that my stories are suspense stories, with the common thread is suspense with elements of horror, elements of sci-fi. That allows me to branch out and write slightly different. What really changed for me though is the first book, indie published, it did really well, 250,000 copies. If you do the math there, you earn about 70 cents on the dollar. So it was a very decent payday. So when the second book was done, I wasn't sure that I was going to go the traditional route because I saw the economics of publishing as an indie. But my wife, again, way smarter than me when it comes to these kind of things. She said, "Go ahead and query a couple of agents. Let's see what happens." Things were very different. I queried 53 agents. I had 13 offers within the first 2 weeks, so I had no trouble, securing a deal with an agent. When my agent took it out to the publishing companies, the offers started coming in. My life literally changed in the course of an afternoon. I got a call saying that we had an offer for $150,000 out of the UK for the book. I ran home and I told my wife, and I said, we're going out to dinner. By the time we got to the restaurant, we were at 800,000. We had broken seven figures by the time we left the restaurant, all within 4 or 5 hour time frame. So that book came out through HarperCollins, HMH, through the traditional model. So I got to see exactly how that worked. And the traditional publishing companies are able to get your books in a lot of places that you can't get as an indie author. They can get you in the grocery stores, the CVS, the department stores, Costco, all these fun places. It's very difficult as an indie. So I got a taste of that. So I kind of started bouncing back and forth. About 4 or 5 books in, I came up with a hybrid approach. I told my agent, I'm going to keep all the English rights for myself. I'm going to indie publish in English, so US, UK, Canada, Australia, those kind of places I'll handle myself, but you're still allowed to go ahead and sell the foreign rights. And at that point, I'm in roughly 150 different countries at this point, 2 different languages or 23 languages. So it's a pretty wide market. So I published in a hybrid model. I did a little bit of all these different things. And for me, that worked out really great because I got to collect that 70 cents on the dollar, but I wasn't able to get into some of those places. So you fast forward to about a year ago, I had a new book coming out called Behind a Closed Door. My agent took it, sent it out to the publishers. We started getting film and TV interest almost immediately. On the publishing side, it was going to auction, which basically means multiple publishers wanted it. And we were about to have that auction, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine that works at Penguin Random House. And she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book. You want to turn it down when that offer comes in. And I asked her why, and she said, well, Penguin Random House is about to lay off a bunch of people, and your editor is one of them, and you don't want to get caught up in that mix. I got a similar phone call from somebody at HarperCollins. So I started conversations with Simon and Schuster. They had recently been bought by a private equity firm, and coming out of the finance world, I knew some of the players involved in that. So I reached out to them. I showed them, my sales numbers on previous books. I told them what I wanted to do from a business standpoint moving forward. And ultimately, we struck a deal where I created my own imprint, my own publishing company with Simon and Schuster behind me to handle print sales and distribution, which is where I'm at today. So any book that I put out today, I basically have the full control of an indie author, but it's coming out through Simon and Schuster. So I'm getting the best of both worlds. So that's where I am today.
What would you say what would you say would be the most challenging piece for an up and coming author who is trying to get to your level of success? What would you say is the most challenging piece?
I think discoverability. From my standpoint, I've been very focused on building a brand. Like JD Barker is my brand. I actually have a trademark on my name. There's, written a certain way. Like all those things were purchased at the get-go. and it's something that's always been conscious and you know in my head, or something I work towards. A lot of authors, they don't do that. Like the publishing companies try not to do it. Like if you get, you know, your first novel gets published through a big publisher, you know, the title is going to be nice and big. The author name is going to be real small down at the bottom. Like ideally, you want that flipped. You want people to walk into a store and see your name, your name, your name. Um, so that's something I've tried to take control of from the get-go. But as an author, if you're new, if this your book is coming out this year, a million books are going to be published this year, and your book is one of them. So you have to put some serious thought into, you know, what am I going to do to make my book stand out in that crazy crowd? You know, if it's coming out through one of the traditional publishers, you know, they're going to do the same thing to market your book that they're doing for all the other ones on their slate. You know, some books will get more money, some books will get less, but you know, they more or less do the same things. If you're an indie author and you're doing the same thing that everybody else is doing, that's not going to work either. So again, you have to think outside the box. I always go back to that. One of the things that I did is, you know, like when TikTok first came out, you know, I watched it and I scrolled it. I tried, you know, I couldn't figure out how do I sell a book on TikTok. Nobody wants to see me dancing around in a bathing suit holding up one of my books. That's not going to move titles. So ultimately, what I ended up doing is I created a mailing list of people that are book talk influencers, people that review books on TikTok. We've got roughly, I think, 4,000 people now on that mailing list. I turned that into a company, a completely standalone company called Best of Book Talk. So once a week, we send a mailing out to those book talk influencers, and we give them titles that I get through the traditional publishers. So they get an email very similar to BookBub, if you're familiar with that. So it's got 4 or 5 books on it. Influencers can pick the ones that they want to get for free, and the publishers send them those titles, and then they can review them if they like them, or they don't have to. But from my standpoint, now I've got a mailing list of 4,000 or so, you know, book talk influencers. I can drop my own titles in there anytime I want and put them in front of that audience, you know, which in turn has millions of viewers on TikTok. So I approach every situation like that. You know, like if I look at Facebook, I look at what everybody else is doing on Facebook, and just like Madonna, I zig instead of zag and come up with something new.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant idea. In fact, one of the things you mentioned was trying to get noticed, right? In a crowded kind of room. You mentioned about a million books will be coming out. Well, I'm looking at your book right now, The Forsaken. And so I'm just folks for the visual perspective, right? The top of the book, New York Times bestseller. And this is, I feel like this is actually really consistent. So I kind of wanted to ask if this is like a specific science with this, or what. So at the beginning, at the front of the book, right? New York Times bestseller at the top, author. And then your name, like you mentioned, J.D. Barker, extremely big, right? And then below that, it says Forsaken. I would say, you know, I tend to read quite a bit myself, and I have noticed, you know, you have that New York Times stamp on the very top. Like that's the first thing you see all the time. And then usually the author name, or sometimes it's the book name and the author's a little bit lower. What is there any kind of science behind that?
Well, it's a stamp of, it validates the author, right? See, New York Times bestseller. I'm technically a #2 New York Times bestseller. The Crawdaddies was #1 when my last title hit at #2. So, but putting #2 New York Times bestseller doesn't look quite as cool as putting #1. So I don't do that. But you know, like yeah, any type of moniker that you can put out there, you know, again, you're competing against, you know, a million other books. You know, everybody's is brand new at that point. Nobody's gonna, you know, if you're a brand new author, nobody's putting New York Times bestseller. Nobody's putting USA Today or Wall Street Journal or any kind of bestseller moniker because they haven't earned it yet. But having it allows you to stand out in that crowd. And I can tell you, like from a bookstore standpoint, that's when the bookstores start to, you know, stock your title. They see that. I mean, I didn't see, like Forsaken was indie published, but you can find it today at an airport bookstore, which is probably the hardest place to get into. I actually saw it at an airport bookstore in Istanbul. You know, so like it is everywhere, but it's an indie published title. But it's all because, you know, I've hit certain milestones that allow me to, you know, kind of rise to the top, like the cream of the crop. And that's all you can do. You just basically keep making enough noise where, you know, more and more people get to know who you are. And before you know it, you know, you do become a familiar name, a familiar brand, and more people are picking it up. I've been told you have to touch somebody, you know, 8 to 10 times before they, you know, before they remember it from an advertising standpoint. So, you know, I try to get out there as much as possible.
Yeah, so this is kind of a two-part question because it's very interesting what you mentioned. You mentioned that the one of the hardest locations to actually get into was an airport. So again, two-part question. One, what is kind of that scale? So if an author, just for general understanding, what is that scaled easeability in locations to get into versus the difficulty locations to get into? And then how did you yourself build up the JD Barker brand enough to get into those difficult locations?
Well, I think most authors, we start off, and I was guilty of this too. My first book was out. I would walk into a bookstore and I would try, hey, can I talk to the manager? Can I talk to the owner? What do I need to do to get my book in here? And the truth is, they're not going to carry your book at that point. If you look around, they've got very limited shelf space. That shelf space is expensive for them to maintain. So they have to make sure they put stuff up there that's going to move. So all you can really do to really get into those bookstores organically is to start selling at, decent numbers. Where you pop up. In my case, I'm lucky because with this deal through Simon & Schuster, Simon & Schuster reps, when they go into a bookstore, they pitch my titles right next to the Simon & Schuster titles. That's not something that I had at the get-go. If you walk into like a Barnes and Noble, most people don't realize this, but every piece of shelf space there is bought and paid for. So that little alcove in the front door is probably the most expensive place you can have your book in that store. The new release table, right in front when you enter that store, that's $20,000 a week to have your
Wow.
title there. This
Wow.
is not something that, I mean, indie authors can do it, if you've got the bankroll behind you, but most indie authors don't. You're very lucky if you can get a traditional publisher to put your debut novel out there. In a lot of ways, it comes down to what, that publisher is willing to spend. If you get a big advance, I've found that, they will put equal dollars into marketing. So if you get a $500,000 advance or $1 million advance, they're going to put a decent amount of money marketing that book because they have to earn that money back. If they give you a small advance, if it's 5,000, 10, 15, 20, chances are they're not going to spend a whole lot on the marketing side because they've got nothing to recoup. And, that low dollar amount basically tells you, I don't want to say that's what they think of your book, but that's basically where they categorized you. And, you need to move the needle. You got to be one of those big dollars for it all to make sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That you have to have the return on investment for sure, and you also have to understand like what is your own worth. I'm assuming because it sounds like a lot of these times you're kind of going into negotiations, essentially selling your value as not only an author but as a continuous support of or continuous value of that organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the other things that I've been very conscious of is to make sure that I do a lot of high profile projects. Right after Forsaken came out, I signed on with Bram Stoker's family to write a prequel to Dracula using Bram Stoker's original notes. That was high profile. We sold the film rights to that before, we were literally in the car touring the publishing companies to try and figure out which deal we wanted to take there, and we sold the film rights. I always try to have one of those high profile type projects going at any given time. So I had the Dracula one. I've written a bunch of books with James Patterson. Just having that, my name on the same cover as his gets it in a lot of different places, which creates that recognition. Right now, I'm working on I'm rebooting the Flatliners franchise. If you remember that movie from 1990s,
Yeah.
I'm writing a book to reboot the franchise. So that's again another high profile project. As soon as word of that leaked, we got interviewed by probably 20 different publications, and it was all over the internet. Like I purposely seek those types of things out because they organically create buzz for you. You don't have to pay people to write those stories. Those are things that people want to hear about and they come to you. So I try to have something like that going on at any given moment while I'm also working on my regular titles. It's all about raising the boat, like that. Every little thing raises your boat, your profile just a little bit more in that harbor. And before you know it, it's one of those things everybody knows who you are.
How do you, when you're going through the process of starting a new book, and again, folks, all this, if you're looking for JD as a book list, I'm going to have it on the Shades of Entrepreneurship. Visit the Shades of E, subscribe to the newsletter. We'll make sure we have a blog with JD's information on there. So please, again, subscribe. JD, how do you go through your process? Because you've written a lot of books now, and you mentioned, they go from thriller to horror to thriller to horror, similar, I guess, but also two very different kind of verticals in regards to the book of the theme. How do you kind of go through the process of creating an idea to write about?
Ideas are a weird thing because you can't force them into your head. They just sort of pop in there. So I've got a note app on my phone called Simple Note where I put everything. And one of those notes is actually called ideas. So if I get any kind of idea for anything that might remotely fit in a book, I drop it in there. To give you an example of how my last one came together, it's called Behind a Closed Door. I had a husband and wife couple that I knew I wanted to write about. Their names were Brendan and Abby Hollander. And it was basically a couple. They were married for about 10 years. They love each other, but the marriage has kind of, gone sour, just not because they fight, but because, they're leading independent lives. They both have jobs. They're both, running off doing their own thing, and they've grown apart over time. So I had them as a character set that I knew I wanted to use. And they sat in that document for probably about 4 or 5 years. And then one night I was talking to my wife. Yeah, I mentioned that we do real estate. She had bought this big house in Georgia that she wanted to renovate and turn into an Airbnb. And we were having dinner and we were discussing it. And she mentioned that it had 7 bathrooms. And she's like, how am I going to renovate 7 bathrooms quickly? And just, I brought up a company called Bath Fitters, which we've all seen the commercials. They come in one day and they retrofit your bathroom. They do a cosmetic thing and they're in and out. We just talked about it, just a casual conversation over dinner. But that night on our phones, we both started seeing ads for bath fitters pop up in our social media feeds. Commercials started to pop up on our TV on Hulu. So I researched that and then realized in the terms of service for our phones, whether you've got an iPhone or an Android, we give them permission to do that. So right now, my phone is sitting right next to me. It's listening to this entire conversation that we're having, and it's grabbing these keywords out of the air, and it's going to put that in a database and find some way to use that to market to me later. So when I realized that, I took that idea and combined it with Brendan and Abby, my characters, and that became the genesis of Behind a Closed Door. They basically download an app to their phone, recommended to them by a marriage counselor to help spice up their marriage. The app is called Sugar and Spice. It's basically Truth or Dare for adults, but it has the ability to really dig into their lives, into their phones, and that data that's on your app. And the scariest thing about this book is, as frightening as it is, everything that happens in the story could happen in real life. Because I pulled the data from real things that exist today. So that's kind of how it happened. If I would have had the bath fitter story all by itself, it may still be sitting on that app, but multiple pieces came together. It's sort of like chocolate and peanut butter.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I feel like some of the most frightening things in the world are things that we tend to like go through every day and just don't know how frightening they are. Like going online and purchase, or putting your social security online for a credit card, for a credit card application, and then a couple days later they get hacked, or it's just constantly something across the spectrum that is very unique. Now, what would you say would say was your funnest book to write that you have written so far?
Oh, wow. They're sort of like your kids. Like, people ask me which one's my favorite. My favorite tends to be the latest one. I think my funnest one to write, though, is called A Caller's Game. Because at that point, that was like my fifth or sixth novel, and everything I had written up until that point had gotten optioned for film or a streaming series or something. So while I was writing that book, I was like, I'm going to write something that they can't possibly film. So in this book, I blow up like half of New York. Thinking there's no way they're going to be able to film this story. It's too crazy. It's too out there. And while we were shopping the book, Ridley Scott's company came in and they optioned it. So there was a film in the works. And I learned they can film basically anything. It just gets expensive. So to film this particular book is about at the time it was about $200 million. But they can get it done. But like that was fun to write. Another fun one was Coast to Coast Murders with Jim Patterson. Because I'm what they call a pantser. I basically come up with an idea for a book and I come up with my characters and I just kind of mix it all together and just sort of run with it. I don't necessarily know where the story is going. Patterson is the opposite. He outlines everything, very, very strictly. He'll come up with a 30 to 40 page outline before he starts writing a book. So when we first talked, we didn't think we'd be able to work together because it's just two totally different competing styles. But ultimately, he agreed to pants a novel. He agreed to try it my way. So we ended up writing Coast to Coast, and we went back and forth. I would write a chapter, and I would paint him into some crazy impossible corner. I would send him the pages, and like, there's no way you're getting out of this. 15 minutes later, he not only got out of it, but he sent me 20 more pages back and put me in an even more difficult situation. And we wrote the whole book that way, just twist after twist, trying to one up each other, and that was a good time.
Yeah, that's such a cool concept, and I feel like I read a lot of Dragonlance right now. That's kind of my sci-fi go-to, by Margaret Weiss and Hickman, and I feel like those two authors, they tend to go back and forth like that quite a bit, where they put these heroes in these very unique situations, and then okay, the next chapter you have to kind of get out of it, right, and so on and so forth. In fact, I was watching a YouTube clip about the South Park creators the other day, and they're talking about storytelling and the importance of storytelling. And they kind of talk about how, today a lot of authors essentially use a lot of ands. This happened and this happened and this happened and they were really encouraging these writers to say, this happened, therefore this happened, because this happened, therefore, and the way they were kind of explaining it to me was really, or explaining it on YouTube was really unique, because it kind of got me to think like, yeah, it makes sense. Because if you put therefore and start to write a little bit afterward, it's almost like you have to get a little bit more detailed into the description of what is occurring versus just saying and Is there any what advice do you have for writers or tips like that that maybe aspiring writers are listening that they should, if they have like a writer's block or if they're struggling, what tips do you have?
One of the simple ones is, and I tend to do this on the second draft, is a lot of us tend to use a lot of adverbs. So Bob said angrily, like that kind of thing. I'll go ahead and write that for the first draft just to get the first draft down on paper. But then when I circle back, I look for any kind of dialogue tag and try to find some way to basically remove that dialogue tag and just beef up the sentence. So whatever Bob said, make that sound angry. Make his actions angry. Bob screamed blah 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 and pounded his fist or something. But like there's ways to tweak it, and like there's not a whole lot to it. It's just a couple words that you're swapping out, but it makes a huge difference when you go back and you reread that book. That's basically what takes it from half baked to fully a fully baked cake.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of almost taking my philosophy and spinning it around completely, where I'm writing a blog and I'm trying to essentially get a sentence down to one word. So I'll look at the thesaurus and say, oh, this one word captures all this. And you're saying, I'm looking at that one word and how can I emphasize and describe that one word in multiple words without actually having to use that word?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite books, there's only two books that I really like on the topic of writing. One of them is called On Writing by Stephen King. Um, Another one is called Reacher Said Nothing. And it's a reporter that sat in Lee Child's apartment while he wrote one of the Jack Reacher novels. He literally just sat on the couch while Lee was typing away on his computer. And he would, stare over his shoulder and just kind of follow along. But the way that it's written, it basically shows you the organic structure of a novel. Like how it started, the middle, the end, and how he got there. But one of the things I like about it is in that book, he has one particular sentence, and it starts off, I think, like 8 or 9 words long, and he keeps revisiting it, and he takes a word out. He swaps these two words for something else, and before, by the time you reach the end of the book, it's down to like 3 words to basically describe the same thing. Um, we do quite a bit of that. I mean, when I wrote with Patterson, there was a particular scene in one of the books where some characters had to have a dinner. So they sat down for dinner. There was a conversation. Like to me, it had to happen because in that conversation, they communicated information we needed in the story. But it ended up being like 3 or 4 pages of these people having dinner. So he got those pages, he read it. He's like, is there any reason we can't just say they had dinner? 3 words, which eliminates all these pages. And then he just grabbed the 2 or 3 sentences that needed to be communicated and he just plugged those in different parts of the book and basically streamlined it. Writing really comes down to editing in the end. Like anybody I think can write a book, the successful authors know how to edit a book.
That's a good point. And one of the things I kind of I'm struggling with just of like, my own creativity, writing blog posts and kind of posting them up is I think with the online world, the virtual world, it's there's so much of an importance on, SEO and keywords. Is there any importance on keywords when writing a book?
Not really when writing a book, but I understand what you're talking about because I write for Rolling Stone on the side just for fun.
Just for
And
fun.
they'll often just for fun, yeah. They often tweak my title or something
Yep.
just from an SEO standpoint, or the first couple of sentences of the story they'll change a couple of words, and the reasoning is always SEO. For me personally, like I don't think about that. Like as I'm writing, I write what I want to write and I send it off to them. But SEO is huge. I mean, like 1 or 2 words can make a difference between it appearing on the first page of a Google result versus the fifth page.
Yep.
So you have to be cognizant of it.
Yeah. And that's, I got to tell you folks, I've been running the podcast about 3 years now, or I think we're about 100 and almost 200 episodes running up on that. And I've been doing the blog posts again. Check it out, theshadesofE.com. You can subscribe to the newsletter by visiting theshadesofE.com. And I will say I'm working backwards has been difficult because I'm starting to, I think after the first year and a half, I'm like, okay, got a lot of content. Why am I not getting a lot of visitors on the blog? And so they started, diving deep into that. First year was really about the podcast editing, making sure my audio is correct, making sure, all that's all. Now it's like starting to transfer over to the web design, right? And I got to tell you this morning, I was literally in front of my webpage with the Rabbit SEO, right, helper, going through all my different pages and saying, oh, well, this is less than 55 characters. It needs to be more. I'm like, well, if I do it anymore, then it becomes too like it's not explaining it too quickly, or it's like I'm struggling with myself because similar to you, JD, I like to get things out in 1 or 2 sentences.
Yeah. No, I'm in the same boat. I've got people that do that sort of thing for me, but like I really pick their brain on why. Like if they change something, I just I need to understand it. Like I can't just pay somebody to do it and walk away. Like I need to understand why they're tweaking it. And like some of the reasons, like they make very little sense, but it works.
Yep.
Certain keywords just tend to resonate. And, if I've got a story, that shows up, on page 1 of my Google results one week, and then it drops to page 3, like I've got somebody I can call that can tell me exactly why. And it's always something silly, like they make a quick little change in a keyword or something in the title, and it's back on the #1 page again.
Yeah.
If you have any type of blog, any type of online presence, though, you do need to get familiar with that, because it translates across the board. If you're posting on TikTok, like it's the same thing, like your title, the text and everything you put in there, those hashtags, the words you use in your video, like all of those things are they go into those databases, like I mentioned earlier, and that's what the algorithms feed off of. And you need to understand how those work.
Yeah, I really like what you said too in regards to just understanding like the key, not necessarily the keywords, but kind of understanding like what those algorithms are, because I think that's another difficulty too, because each system, TikTok, Facebook, websites, they all have their kind of own algorithm. And so understanding that is really important. And then again, testing your thesis, going back, like you mentioned, JD, I really like the, the idea of going and actually checking where you're ranking on the Google page. And understanding like the SEO piece, it does take some time. I also like what you mentioned, like I like to do it all, and that's very much me. I'd like to at least try it so I can get a good baseline knowledge of what I'm doing before I outsource it. Because if I outsource it before I know what I'm doing, then I don't know if you're doing a good or job or bad job, because I have no baseline knowledge, right? And at least I'm trying to create a baseline knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you from an author standpoint, like I've got a lot of bios on different websites. Barnes and Noble has one, Amazon's got one, this guy's got one, that guy's got one. If those bios aren't current, like they will drop down in those search results. And by current, I basically mean like it knows, like Google search algorithms understand what my next book is. So if it's not mentioned in my bio, or if the book that's mentioned in that bio is an older title, like that algorithm actually understands that and recognizes it. So you have to update all of those different things and stay on top of it.
Yes. And folks, again, I will make sure I try to update JD's bio. That will be again on the Shades of E website. So go ahead and subscribe to that. Now, JD, what's the next? What is the next book? What are we working on?
Well, right now I'm following, James Patterson's lead, and I'm working with a lot of co-authors. I've got, starting in November, I've got one book coming out a month, which is a pretty
Wow.
aggressive publishing schedule. But through that deal that I mentioned, I'm able to do that. But what I'm finding is it's allowing me to write books that I wouldn't be able to write on my own. Like my next one is called Heavier the Stones. I wrote it with a girl named Christine Daigle, who's a neuropsychologist. So she brought that knowledge base to the table when we wrote that book. And it's a fantastic serial killer story. And like I know I could have written it on my own, but like having that extra piece in there and her knowledge, it took it to another level. So like I'm really focusing on that, bringing in people that may not make sense quite on paper, but like when you put them together, it works really, really well, to create stories that still kind of follow the same suspense and the fast pacing and stuff that people are used to from me. But it allows me to tell different stories I wouldn't be able to come up with strictly on my own. So I'm hoping that works well. But the next one is, it's Heavier the Stones. It comes out in November. That's the first one.
Heavier Than Stones, folks. Again, if you forget all that, they will be on the shadesofE.com website. So go ahead and subscribe to their newsletter. And one of the things I liked about that, JD, is you kind of also elevate authors that when you attach your name to them, one, and then two, even if you don't put your name to that book, you're still providing a lot of knowledge to these individuals.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of how it started, because I used to mentor authors. Like they would come to me and like I would teach them how to write a book from start to finish, and they would pay me for that. And I always felt icky taking money for it. But I had to charge something because it worked as a gatekeeper. I got to kind of keep the riffraff out. Only the ones who really wanted to do it would pay. But I didn't feel right about that, so I kind of flipped the whole model on its head. So instead, I bring these people aboard. I pay them to write the book with me, but I teach them exactly how to do it. From creating the title and the tagline and the backup book blurb, creating an outline, and I walk them through every single chapter. I walk them through the pacing thing and get them basically up their game. By the time they're done, they get a crash course, which is no different from what James Patterson taught me. Like you mentioned his master class, after writing 5 books with him, like he literally calls and yells at me on the phone when I do something wrong. Like it doesn't get any better than that. But like I can hear him up here, every time I put a sentence on paper. So I try to do that for new up and coming authors. And luckily, because of my name recognition and presence, I'm able to get, books with my name and now their name into some of those places we mentioned earlier, which they probably couldn't do on their own. So it elevates everybody. So I think it works really well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, all ships rise, all tides. I think the phrase goes, or something similar to that. Now, JD,
Yeah.
for those individuals that are listening to this show, maybe they are interested in writing a co-author book or getting some mentorship and pulling out their wallets to pay you handsomely for that time. How can they contact you? Or what's the best way? Where are you at on the internet? Where can they find your books?
Well, I don't take payment for that anymore, but you're welcome to reach out. The easiest place to find me is jdbarker.com. Literally everything is there. The next appearance I have, I think, is going to be the Author Nation conference in November. So if you are an author, an aspiring author, and you're going to be at Author Nation, I'll be there all week long. So feel free to track me down.
And when is that again? November?
It's, I believe, the first or second week of November. I don't know the
Perfect.
exact
Again,
dates.
folks, author conference coming up. And again, all this information will be on the shadesofe.com website. So go ahead and subscribe to the newsletter. JD, this is a really, really unique conversation, really exciting stuff. I'm really like truly impressed with your background and your experience and how it has evolved from, hating the corporate job that you have to, it seems like you really are enjoying life and what you're doing today.
Well, entrepreneurship, right? Like that's kind of what it's all about. You don't allow yourself to get complacent. You get everything working, and then you look at, where's that next brass ring? How can I take it to another level? And that's where I'm kind of always at, and that's what keeps it entertaining, keeps it fun for me.
That is very true. Yes, it's a constant move. I hate being in one place for too long. I gotta kind of learn something new. I'm okay being the jack of all trade, master of none to a certain extent. But eventually, if you find your passion, by all means, go all in and become the master of that passion. JD, thank you again so much for being on the show. Is there any last words you have to say for the guests?
No, I'm all good. Have a wonderful weekend.
JD Barker, again, the author of so many books. Again, folks, this information will be on the shadesofe.com. So please subscribe to us, and you can visit us on the website, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and Facebook by visiting the Shades of E. Thank you and have a great night.